Japan began to exercise complete control over the internal affairs of Korea after the treaty between the Japanese and Korean governments in 1905. It is said that this treaty was never ratified by the Korean king. In 1910, based on provisions of the treaty, Japan annexed Korea, and Japanese colonial policy and practices began. Meanwhile, Japan continued expanding territories throughout the Asian Pacific. Beginning during this time, and especially due to the outbreak of World War I, Japan experienced tremendous industrial expansion, which increased the demand for cheap labor from the country's occupied territories. Later, the global military conflict that started in 1939 brought Japan into the Second World War. As the Japanese war zone expanded in the late 1930s, Japan suffered serious shortages of manpower.
Japan needed Korean men in order to replace the loss of its own forces, including labor and military forces.
Starting in 1939, the government in Japan began to set up a system to conscript Koreans into the Japanese labor force. These Korean laborers worked under slave-like conditions to construct airfields, harbors, mines, roads, and civilian enterprises for Japan's war effort.
Recruitment in Korea was initially conducted by private companies in 1939. From 1942, it was conducted by government-assisted conciliation organizations, and later, Korean citizens were drafted by the Japanese under the national conscription law. It's generally said that the practices of forced labor were conducted in this period, but I also strongly believe that forced labor practices can be found before that period, particularly after Japan annexed Korea in 1910.
As time went on and the war progressed, Japan responded to its great need for workers with even more forceful methods. Recruitment in Korea was carried out by officials working hand in hand with police who employed an element of coercion. Unmo Chung remembers being taken to the Ashio copper mine in Tochigi Prefecture in Japan as a forced labor in 1942 when he was 19 years old.
1942년 2월 15일경이라고 생각하는데.
I remember it was February 15th, 1942, when I was called into the village office. I didn't know why they called me at that time, but I went there anyway. When I entered the room in the office, a man named Chang Soo Lee stared at me and said, "You, go to Japan and work there for 2 or 3 years." I was so shocked, and I told him I couldn't go. When I said I needed to stay to care for my mother, he stood up and slapped my face and kicked me. I realized something was going on. I went back home as quickly as I could, and I decided to flee from the village with my mother on the next day, early in the morning, because the sun usually rises late in February. The next morning, when my mother and I were about to leave our house, it was too late. Our house was surrounded by 5 people. They came to me and said, "Where are you going?" I told them, "I am not going anywhere." I was captured and put into a truck forcibly. I couldn't escape because 2 of them grabbed me by my arms. I was taken to Cheonju in the truck. It took about 20 to 30 minutes to get there. When we got there, there were about 150 people who were taken forcibly like me. We were kidnapped.
Forced labor, including military comfort women, is defined as any work or service which is exacted from any person under pressure or menace, deceived with false working conditions, or taken as if he were a hunted slave. Forced labor is any work the person has not offered himself voluntarily.
I was forced to work on the mine pit road construction, carrying construction tools as heavy as 40 to 50 kilograms every day. My main work was to blast the rocks with explosives at the front line of the mine. That was the most dangerous work of all.
Working conditions in the mines were very dangerous, often life-threatening. Regardless the danger or their contribution to Japan's war effort, the conscripted Korean workers were not paid.
지강화 기마 때나 이네. 돈이야 그 지강 누나.
There was no fixed working hour. We kept working till our task of the day was done. It didn't matter how long it took. We worked for 12 to 15 hours a day. Around the 25th of each month, we were gathered to receive our wages. But we never received the wages. What they gave us was so-called bonds issued by the Japanese government.
Along with the bonds, Korean forced laborers received 3 to 5 yen per month, just enough to buy a package of cigarettes. If Japan were to win the war, so the laborers were told, fortune would also come to the Korean workers.
날 두드려 패면서 대미라 한도지 이삐기 니 기구라이 구다바타 도트도 나이.
They told me, we don't care if 1 or 2 Koreans die. We can ship hundreds of thousands of Koreans with 3 sen. Then they continuously beat and kicked me. I was so mortified but tried not to cry. 3 sen in Japanese yen was the cost of 1 postage stamp at that time. What they meant was they could ship Koreans if they sent a request letter with a 3 sen stamp. 30 million Korean lives were worth less than a postage stamp.
3천만 인구의 그 목숨이.
彼が常日頃言ってる言葉の中で
Mr. Chung always states that he was tortured by the Japanese, but saved by the Japanese. He was forcibly taken to Japan by the Japanese in 1941 and escaped from Ashio Copper Mine in 1944. It was a Japanese field supervisor in the mine who secretly helped him to escape from the labor camp.
요만한 조이조가라 하나 딱 날던 내주면서.
One day, a field supervisor, Mr. Ishikawa, gave me a small note with a map. He explained thoroughly about his plan to help me escape from the mine. What date to escape, which way to go, everything in detail. I was so touched by his warm heart. On April 3rd, 1944, I escaped with 5 other Korean laborers during the daytime. We ran up to the train station and boarded the train. After we got off at Kiryu Station, we started walking. We walked day and night. We sometimes did things out of starvation. One day we were so hungry that we stole a daikon in a mulberry farm and ate it. I told my 5 other friends to work in a Japanese military base. The police couldn't come into the military bases, such as the Sagamihara Air Base in Kanagawa Prefecture, to search for escapees. They would be beaten by the military police called Kenpeitai, so it was safe to work in such places. When the 2 Koreas are reunified, the first thing I want to do is to see Mr. Ishikawa. I have never forgot him all my life.
Taimon Kim is another victim of Japan's system of forced labor. She was taken to Japan in the 1920s at the age of 13.
우리가 못 먹고 못 입고 살아서.
When I was in Korea, my family suffered from poverty. We were so poor that my mother told me to go to Japan and work so that I wouldn't have to worry about food every day. One day when people from Soaikai came to my town, they brought me to Japan. They put most of my salary into their pocket, which I didn't know for many years.
Generally, it is said the practices of forced labor started in 1939 as forms of company-directed recruitment, government-assisted recruitment, or forced drafting under the National Mobilization Law. But in the case of Mrs. Kim, she was recruited through the Japanese Mutual Corps Association called Soaikai back in the 1920s. Soaikai promised she would be able to earn a lot of money in Japan. Based on that promise, she voluntarily applied for the job and was brought to a spinning factory in Toyowashi, Shizuoka Prefecture.
Soaikai was initially organized by Koreans in Japan in the 1920s as an effort to provide social services and job opportunities to Koreans. The Sowai Kai was also intended to promote friendship between Japanese citizens and the Korean workers. But the Sowai Kai later came to function as a control organ employed by the Japanese government to further exploit the Korean workers.
경찰서인가 어디서 이제 그
I wasn't old enough to work legally when I was brought to Japan. Once or twice a month, the police came to the factory to search for underage workers. Whenever the police came, the supervisor of the factory would try to hide us.
彼女たちはほとんど賃金というものを
Korean workers there had barely got paid their wages. In spite of that, Mrs. Kim worked from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, from daybreak to dark. She told me she never saw sunlight while she was there. I believe this is considered forced labor, resulting from the Japanese colonial rule over Korea.
아버지, 어머니, 아이고.
I missed my parents and my home every night. We were poor, but I would have been happier if I lived with my family.
벌 살도 집에 가고 있어.
ほとんど聞いたことは없습니다ね.
I didn't know about my mother's past, neither did my sisters. My mother didn't want to talk about what she'd been through in the past. When I asked her about it, she told me she couldn't explain in words. Since then, I've never asked. When the book about forced Korean laborers was published in Japan, I found a story of my mother and told my sister to read it. Reading through the book, I couldn't help crying. I didn't know she went through such hardships in the past.
On August 15, 1945, the Second World War officially ended. 3 days later, Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, which put an end to Japanese aggression and its colonial rule in Asia. The end of the war meant liberation of Korean workers who were forcibly taken to Japan during the war, including Un Mo-chung.
수세무가에서도 말이에요. 다 기쁘게 생각을 못 하고
I was
있었어.
so happy not because my country became independent, but because I was set free and I didn't have to hide from police anymore.
According to government documents, the total number of Koreans taken to Japan during the war reached about 720,000. However, the number is likely to be much higher. It was later learned that most of the documents pertaining to Japan's labor force of conscripted Korean workers were destroyed shortly after the war. To this day, the Japanese government remains unwilling to release any remaining materials related to the Korean labor force.
解放前後
Right after World War II, there were approximately 2.4 million Koreans in Japan. Most of them were forcibly taken to Japan as labor forces during wartime, and some were willing immigrants before the war. Within 1 year after the end of the war, about 1.8 million Koreans returned to their country. About 600,000 Koreans remained in Japan.
저선 갈 마음도 안 먹었어.
I didn't want to go back to Korea. I decided to live in Japan. Why should I go back to the place in which I was always in poverty?
大陸に行った日本人を帰国させるために
Right after the war, the Japanese government made arrangements for the return of the Koreans. The Koreans were put aboard ships that carried the Japanese people back from Korea or China as they made the return voyage. But in most cases, Koreans collected money, chartered ships on their own, and returned from ports, mostly in Kyushu or the western part of Japan. However, because the sea between Japan and Korea, called Genkai Nada, is usually extremely rough, most of the ships never made their way to Korea. Many Koreans never returned home.
90% of Korean forced laborers were brought from southern Korea. Many of the southern Korean workers returned to their hometowns after the war, but because of poor relations between North Korea and Japan, similar provisions for returning home were not made for North Korean workers. But by the 1950s, a movement sprang up to help North Koreans return to their homeland. Un Mo-chung strongly supported the movement and participated in a number of demonstrations.
일본인, 조선인.
In that period, many Korean men and their wives, including those who married Japanese women, went back to North Korea. I wanted to go there even though my husband had to stay in Japan to help support the movement.
Despite the efforts, problems for former forced Korean laborers and even their descendants remain today. Today, the unpaid wages, compensation for their labor, and full disclosure of government documents remain central issues in the debate regarding Japan's forced Korean labor. Victims of forced labor have tried legal actions against the Japanese government to seek an official apology and compensation. So far, none of the lawsuits have been successful.
韓国とはその国と国との間で決着。
The Japanese government believes that the compensation issue was already settled between the Japanese and Korean governments. Therefore, Japanese courts refuse to make judgments on those claims by individual victims.
Unmo Chung continues the struggle by staying involved in several human rights activities. Such activities include lectures at universities and testifying in public places.
I always encourage my husband with all my heart. What he does makes the rest of his life worth living.
When I gave a lecture in Nagoya, I had a lot of questions from the audience. One of the audience asked me why I didn't sue the Japanese government. I told him I would not sue the Japanese government because it is impossible to get a fair judgment from Japanese courts. I had lengthy applause from the audience. I believe the only place where I could make an action is the United Nations. That is why I have appealed this forced labor issue twice at the United Nations Human Rights Subcommittee.
日本人としてはやっぱり
We as Japanese should know the truth in history. We should know how Korean people suffered from the Japanese colonial rule. When we achieve this, we'll be able to build a true friendship with the Korean people.
My life was totally ruined. If I had been in Korea, I would probably have married a Korean woman. And I can't imagine. I wish I could live and die in my own country. No matter how good or bad your country is, it is your motherland and it is your home.